Hello, boys and girls. We have another book to read. This one is called Easy Work, An Old Tale. This one is retold by Eric A. Kimmel and illustrated by Andrew Glass. So let's get started, see what this one's about. Okay, we see a picture on the left-hand side. It says the Oregon Trail. Now, boys and girls, this is a real thing. This was a real thing. 200 years ago, people would use this trail, or kind of a road, not really a road, when they moved to the western part of the United States. They would load everything they own in a covered wagon and go out and just walk or ride in their wagon out to the western part of the United States. So it was a real thing. It's kind of cool. So let's get started. It says, Mr. and Mrs. McTeague came over the Oregon Trail with 2 oxen, a dog, a cat, and a cow named Abigail. They staked a claim in the Willamette Valley and built their cabin up against the hillside. So here we see they have a cabin made kind of out of grass and dirt, and they put it into the hillside. Every morning, as soon as the sun came up, Mr. McTeague went off to the woods with the oxen. He worked hard all day, chopping down trees and pulling stumps. Mrs. McTeague stayed home in the cabin. She worked hard, too. She milked the cow, churned the butter, chopped wood, took care of the baby, spun, wove, sewed, baked, cooked, cleaned, did the laundry, and saw to the 101 chores that go with running a house. One evening, Mr. McTeague came home. "I'm tuckered out," he said, as he sat down at the dinner table. "So am I," said Mrs. McTeague. "What are you tired for? You don't do anything but sit around the house all day. That's easy work." "Oh, is that what you think?" Mrs. McTeague exclaimed. "You should stay home and do what I do. Then you'll know what work really is." "I'd like to," said Mr. McTeague. "I could use a rest." "So could I," said Mrs. McTeague. Mr. and Mrs. McTeague decided to switch jobs. The next morning, Mrs. McTeague would go off to the woods, and Mr. McTeague would stay home and do the chores. "Mind what you're doing. I don't want to come home and find a mess," Mrs. McTeague said before she left. "After you milk Abigail, take her up the hillside to graze. Check to make sure she doesn't wander away. Churn the butter, bake the biscuits, and keep your eye on the baby. Do you think you can handle that?" "Easy work," said Mr. McTeague. Mrs. McTeague shouldered the axe and led the oxen off to the woods. Mr. McTeague watched from the doorway. "Now, what was the first thing I had to do?" he said, as soon as Mrs. McTeague was out of sight. "Oh, I remember. Milk the cow." Mr. McTeague carried the pail and the milking stool out to the pasture. He tied Abigail to the fence and began milking her. Suddenly, Abigail lifted her leg and kicked over the pail. "Oh, jumpin' Jerusalem!" Mr. McTeague exclaimed. When he bent down to pick up the milking pail, Abigail kicked him over. "Oh, you wicked beast!" Mr. McTeague cried. Then he realized what was wrong. "Abigail doesn't recognize me. She's used to being milked by Mrs. McTeague." Mr. McTeague had a plan. He put on Mrs. McTeague's bonnet and Sunday dress. Sure enough, Abigail thought he was Mrs. McTeague. She let him milk her without any trouble at all. Of course, Mrs. McTeague's Sunday dress got mighty dirty with milk and mud and cow pies, but Mr. McTeague didn't worry about that. "Easy work, nothing to it," he exclaimed. Now it was time to take the cow up the hillside to graze. "I can't stand around and watch her. I've got a better idea," Mr. McTeague said. He tied a rope to Abigail's hind leg, let it down through the chimney, and tied it to his ankle. "Now for the chores." Mr. McTeague mixed up the biscuits, put them in the Dutch oven, and then set them to rise. He poured the milk into the churn and started churning. It took longer than he expected. "The butter won't come," Mr. McTeague said. "I'll give it a rest. I know I need one." Mr. McTeague laid down on the bed and had a nap. He awoke in time for lunch. "I'm hungry," said Mr. McTeague. He cut himself 6 slices of bacon. He put them in the skillet, lit a fire in the hearth, and set out to frying them. Then he went back to the churn. The dog smelled the frying bacon, and he wandered into the cabin and lay down on the floor, wagging his tail back and forth. The cat came in too. She settled herself beside the churn, hoping for a few drops of milk. Suddenly, the baby began crying. "Holy Hannah!" cried Mr. McTeague. "I can't churn the butter, fry the bacon, bake the biscuits, and rock the cradle too." And just then he had an idea. He tied the cradle to the dog's tail. Then he sliced some more bacon and cut it into little pieces. He threw the pieces to the dog one by one. The dog wagged his tail, the tail rocked the cradle, and the baby fell asleep. "Easy work," said Mr. McTeague, feeling proud of himself. He went back to the churn, but the butter still wouldn't come. "There must be a better way," said Mr. McTeague. Suddenly he had another idea. He got out the flour barrel, turned it on its end, and set a chair on top of it. Then he got out his banjo, climbed onto the barrel, and sat himself down in the chair, and tied the end of the churn to his leg with another piece of rope. Mr. McTeague started picking his banjo and singing, "Oh, don't you remember sweet Betsy from Pike, who crossed the wide prairie with her lover Ike?" He kept time with his foot. As his leg moved up and down, so did the handle of the churn. After each song, Mr. McTeague threw a piece of bacon to the dog. The dog wagged his tail, the cradle rocked back and forth, the churn went up and down, the bacon sizzled in the skillet, the biscuits rose in the Dutch oven. Abigail grazed on the hillside while Mr. McTeague sat on top of the flour barrel, playing the banjo and having a gay old time. "Easy work, nothing to it," said Mr. McTeague. He even made up a song that he sang to the tune of Little Brown Jug. "I work my fingers to the bone, mother sits at home alone, loafs around the livelong day, mighty easy work, I say. Ha, 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 I do say, women's work is child's play. Ha, 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 I can see, that's the kind of work for me." But the butter still won't come. Mr. McTeague began to get sleepy, his head drooped forward, and soon he was snoring. That's when the trouble started. Bacon grease in the skillet caught fire. The dog began barking and woke up the baby. The baby began screaming and woke up the cat. The cat began yowling and woke up Mr. McTeague, who opened his eyes to find the back wall of the cabin ablaze. "Golly Neds," he yelped. He grabbed for the water bucket to put out the fire. Unfortunately, he forgot he was sitting on top of the flour barrel, tied to the churn. Over went the barrel, over went the churn, over went Mr. McTeague. The dog saw his chance. He grabbed the whole slab of bacon and ran out the door, dragging the cradle behind him. "The baby!" cried Mr. McTeague, covered with flour and dripping milk, still wearing Mrs. McTeague's bonnet and Sunday dress. With the churn tied to his leg, he took off after the dog. When the dog saw this terrifying apparition coming after him, he dropped the bacon and ran up the hillside, still dragging the cradle with the poor baby screaming her head off. The dog ran straight for the cow. Oh dear. The cow took fright and bolted over the hill as fast as she could go. Unfortunately, the rope on her hind leg was still tied to Mr. McTeague's ankle. As Abigail ran away, she dragged Mr. McTeague back into the burning cabin, through the milk and flour, through the sizzling bacon grease, over the Dutch oven, across the ashes, up the chimney, and over the top of the hill. Oh dear, look at this. This is a mess. Mrs. McTeague came home from a hard day's work in the woods. She had cut down trees, pulled stumps, burned brush. It was hard work, but not much harder than what she was used to. She came home expecting to find supper on the table. Instead, she found the cabin burned to the ground, the baby covered with dirt, crying in her broken cradle, the cat lapping up the last of the milk, the dog gnawing on the last of the bacon, the cow gone, and Mr. McTeague, dressed in the ragged remains of Mrs. McTeague's bonnet and Sunday dress. His hair and beard were singed off, and he was covered from the top of his head to the heels of his boots with flour, curdled milk, bacon grease, biscuit dough, ashes, soot, mud, grass, leaves, twigs, and poison ivy. Easy work, eh? Said Mrs. McTeague. Mr. McTeague had nothing to say. And there you see, boys and girls, a pile of a mess that Mr. McTeague made. Oh dear. Mr. and Mrs. McTeague built a new cabin. Abigail came home, and eventually everything was set to rights. Mrs. McTeague continued taking care of the house, while Mr. McTeague saw to plowing, planting, and clearing the land. It was hard work, all right, but not nearly as dangerous as housework. Easy work? Laughed Mrs. McTeague. Mr. McTeague shook his head. Not hardly.